The dust of the Mojave Desert has a way of settling on everything, and on everyone. It coated the windows of the Desert Rose Diner, a small, unassuming building just off a two-lane highway that cut through the heart of Mojave Springs. The town itself wasn't much more than a collection of single-story homes, a gas station, a post office, and the diner. It was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. A forgotten corner of the American West. Inside the diner, Eleanor Vance, known to everyone as Ellie, wiped down the worn Formica countertop. She was a woman in her early 60s, with kind eyes the color of a faded blue sky and hands that were never still. Her hair, mostly gray with streaks of a once fiery red, was tied back in a simple bun. To the handful of regulars who sat in her vinyl booths, and to the truckers who stopped for her famous cherry pie, Ellie was as much a part of the landscape as the Joshua trees that dotted the horizon. She was a simple woman, quiet and steady, who had run the diner alone since her husband, Bill, had passed away a decade ago. The air in the diner was usually filled with the smell of fresh coffee, the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, and the low hum of conversation, but lately, a new sound had forced its way into the life of Mojave Springs. It was a sound that started as a distant whisper and grew into a thundering roar that shook the very foundations of the old buildings. It was the sound of power, the sound of progress, the sound of the F-22 Raptors from the nearby Air Force Base. For most of her life, Ellie had considered that sound a comfort, a blanket of security woven by the brave men and women who served. Her Bill had been an Air Force man, a mechanic who could coax any engine back to life. The sound of jets had been the soundtrack to their love story. But these new jets were different. They were louder, sharper, more aggressive. They tore through the silence of the desert with an arrogance that felt alien to her. This morning the roar was closer than usual. Ellie paused, her hand holding the damp cloth, and looked out the window. Two silver darts, impossibly fast, screamed across the sky, their afterburners leaving faint trails in the crisp morning air. They were flying low, far too low. The windows of the diner rattled in their frames, and the coffee in the pot on the warmer rippled as if in fear. Old man Hemlock, a rancher who had lived in Mojave Springs his entire 80 years, looked up from his newspaper. "They're getting bolder," he grumbled, his voice raspy from a lifetime of dust and sun. "No respect. Used to be they'd stick to the Rangers. Now they use our town for target practice." Ellie offered a weak smile. "They're just boys." Henry, young and full of vinegar. But she didn't believe her own words. There was something more than youthful energy in those low passes. There was a carelessness, a disregard that pricked at her sense of order and decency. Miles away, on the sprawling state-of-the-art Air Force Base, the boys in question were climbing out of their multi-million-dollar machines. Major Cody Jensen, Calcine Viper, pulled off his helmet, his face flushed with adrenaline and pride. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with a cocky grin that rarely left his face. He was the best of the best, a Top Gun in the most advanced fighter jet the world had ever known, and he knew it. His wingman, a younger pilot named Green, was buzzing. "Did you see the dust kick up, Viper? We must have been just a few hundred feet off the deck." Viper slapped him on the shoulder. "That's how you let them know we're here, kid. You gotta shake the dust off those old relics every now and then. Remind them what freedom sounds like." He looked out across the tarmac, in the direction of the small town shimmering in the heat haze. "Did you see that little diner? The Desert Rose looked like something out of a black and white movie. Bet we spilled their coffee." The other pilots in their squadron laughed. They were a new breed, trained on simulators that were more real than reality, flying jets that were more computer than machine. They saw the world below them not as a place where people lived, but as a map, a series of coordinates and obstacles. The small towns, the lonely highways, the quiet lives of people like Ellie Vance was all just part of the terrain, insignificant and antiquated. Back in the diner, Ellie picked up a framed photograph from a shelf behind the counter. It was a picture of a young Bill, handsome and proud in his Air Force uniform, standing in front of an old F-4 Phantom. The vibration from the jets had knocked it askew. She carefully straightened it, her fingers tracing the outline of her husband's smiling face. "They don't mean any harm, Bill," she whispered to the photograph, a habit she'd never broken. "They just don't understand." But as she placed the photo back on the shelf, a deep, unsettling feeling took root in her heart. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in a very long time, a cold premonition that something was about to change. The simple, quiet life she had so carefully built for herself was fragile as the glass in the picture frame. And the storm that was coming wasn't made of wind and rain. It was made of steel and fire, and it was being flown by men who had forgotten how to look at the world from the ground up. The challenge had been issued, not in words, but in a thunderous roar that had shaken her little diner to its core, and Ellie Vance, the simple woman of Mojave Springs, had heard it loud and clear. The next few days settled into a tense routine. The morning would start with the familiar peace of the desert waking up, the soft light painting the mountains in shades of purple and orange. Then, like clockwork, the peace would be shattered. The F-22s would arrive, their sonic signatures a daily assault on the quiet town. They weren't just passing by anymore. They were performing for an audience that hadn't bought a ticket. Ellie tried to ignore it. She told herself it was a phase, a new squadron commander letting his pilots blow off steam. She'd seen it before, decades ago. Young men with wings felt like gods, and sometimes they forgot about the mortals below. She focused on her work, kneading dough for the morning's bread, her movements precise and practiced. She poured coffee for the truckers, listened to the ranchers complain about the price of feed, and served up slices of her famous pie with a steady hand and a calm smile. But the pilots were getting more brazen. They had identified the Desert Rose Diner as the unofficial center of the town, a landmark on their new self-pointed playground. One afternoon, as Ellie was helping a family of tourists with directions, two jets came screaming in from the east, lower than ever before. They flew directly over the diner, one after the other, in a deafening, terrifying display. The tourists, a young couple with two small children, dove under their table, the wife letting out a scream. The little boy started to cry. Outside, a cloud of dust and gravel, kicked up by the jet wash, peppered the front of the diner. The large plate glass window, the one that looked out onto the highway, vibrated so violently that a crack appeared in the corner, a thin, spider-webbing line that seemed to trace a map of Ellie's own fraying nerves. But it was what happened inside that broke through her practiced calm. The picture of her husband, Bill, was thrown from its shelf. It didn't just fall, it was launched across the room, landing face down on the linoleum floor with a sickening crunch of breaking glass. After the tourists had hastily paid and fled, their vacation moment ruined, Ellie walked over and picked up the frame. The wood was splintered and the glass had shattered, leaving sharp, glittering shards all over Bill's smiling face. She carefully picked the pieces away, her fingers trembling slightly. It was just a picture, just an object. But it felt like a desecration. It was a line crossed. That evening, after she had closed the diner, Ellie didn't go home. She sat in one of the booths, the broken frame on the table in front of her, and looked at the crack in her window. The setting sun caught the fractured glass, making it sparkle. It was a symbol of what was happening to her town, to her life. A slow, creeping breakage from a force she couldn't see and couldn't reason with. She thought about calling the sheriff, but she knew what he would say. Sheriff Brody was a good man, but he was out of his depth. His authority ended at the town line. The sky belonged to the United States Air Force. Complaining to him would be like complaining to a fence post about the wind. This required something more. This required going to the source. The next morning, her resolve hardened into a cold, clear purpose. She looked up the number for the public affairs office at the Air Force Base. After 3 transfers and a long time on hold, listening to a tinny recording of the Air Force song, a brisk, impersonal voice finally answered. Public Affairs, Sergeant Davis speaking. Ellie took a breath, keeping her voice even and respectful. Good morning, Sergeant. My name is Eleanor Vance. I own a business in Mojave Springs, and I need to file a complaint about some of your pilots. She explained, calmly and clearly, what had been happening. She described the low-altitude passes, the fear of the townspeople, the damage to her property, including the broken window and the shattered picture frame. She was careful not to sound emotional or accusatory. She simply stated the facts. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of typing. Mojave Springs, Sergeant Davis said, his tone dripping with condescension. Right, the little town with the diner. Ellie's grip on the phone tightened. Yes, that's the one. Ma'am, the sergeant said with a sigh, as if explaining something to a child. Our pilots train in that area. It's a designated military operations area. They have to practice low-level maneuvers. It's part of maintaining combat readiness. I understand that, Sergeant, Ellie replied, her patience wearing thin. My husband was in the Air Force for 30 years. I know what training looks like. This isn't training, this is harassment. Harassment is a strong word, Mrs. Vance, he said, a hint of a sneer in his voice. They're the best pilots in the world. flying the best jets. Sometimes that comes with a little noise. I'm sure if you just give it some time, you'll get used to it. I will not get used to my property being damaged and my customers being terrified, Ellie said, her voice dropping, becoming colder. I want this to stop. I want you to talk to their commanding officer. He'll file a report, Sergeant Davis said dismissively. We'll look into it. Thank you for your call. And before Ellie could say another word, the line went dead. She stood there in the quiet of her diner, the dial tone buzzing in her ear. She had been dismissed, patronized, treated like a hysterical old woman who didn't understand the important business of men. The injustice of it was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had tried to do it the right way, the official way, the way Bill would have told her to. She had followed the chain of command, but the chain was broken, or worse, it was working exactly as it was designed to, protecting the powerful from the complaints of the powerless. A few hours later, a young airman, barely 20 years old, came into the diner for lunch. He was polite and shy, and he told Ellie that he worked in flight operations. He mentioned that some of the F-22 pilots had gotten a laugh out of a call that had come in that morning. Some old lady in town called to complain, he said, not realizing he was speaking to the old lady in question. Said they broke her picture frame. Can you believe it? Major Jensen said he was going to send her a bill for the fuel they used to fly over her house. The airman laughed, expecting Ellie to join in. But Ellie just looked at him, her expression unreadable. She felt a cold fury settle deep in her bones. It wasn't just carelessness anymore. It was malicious. They were mocking her. They had turned her life, her home, into a joke. She knew then that looking into it was a lie. Her complaint hadn't gone into a file. It had become locker room gossip. And by complaining, she hadn't solved the problem. She had just painted a bigger target on her own back. The simple woman from the diner had poked the hornet's nest. Now she would have to deal with the swarm. The desert night was cold and silent, a stark contrast to the noise of the day. Ellie sat at her kitchen table, the broken frame of Bill's photograph in front of her. She had removed the picture itself, tucking it safely into a book, but the shattered wood and glass remained, a testament to her failure. The phone call to the base had been a mistake. It had been naive to think that a system designed to project power would listen to a whisper of dissent from a forgotten town. Mind, which for 10 years had been occupied with pie recipes and supply orders, began to drift back, pulling her into a past she had deliberately locked away. The memories came not as a flood, but as sharp, vivid snapshots. She saw herself, 30 years younger, not in a floral apron but in a dark blue Air Force flight suit. Her hair, then a brilliant shade of auburn, was cut short and practical. She wasn't in a kitchen. She was in ASCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, a windowless room bathed in the cool, sterile glow of dozens of computer monitors. The air hummed with the sound of servers and whispered conversations. Men with eagles on their shoulders and PhDs in physics would stop at her console, their faces etched with concern, and ask, "Athena, what do you see?" Athena, that was her name back then, not Ellie, the friendly diner owner. Athena, the lead architect of Project Chimera, a program so secret that most of the Air Force didn't even know it existed. It wasn't about building faster jets or bigger bombs. It was about the opposite. It was about silence. It was about the new frontier of warfare, the electromagnetic spectrum. Her team didn't build weapons that exploded. They built systems that could blind, deafen, and confuse the enemy without firing a single shot. They were the ghosts in the machine. She remembered the pride, the thrill of it. They were pioneers, charting a new territory. She could sit at her console in a bunker in Nevada and touch a satellite in geosynchronous orbit. She could make an enemy radar screen show a fleet of 100 bombers where there was only empty sky, or make a real fleet disappear into electronic fog. She wrote the code, designed the hardware, and understood the invisible waves of energy that connected the modern world better than anyone. Then came the other memory, the one that always followed. The one that had made her walk away from it all. It was a mission over a hostile territory, a test of their most advanced system. 2 pilots, young men she had briefed herself, were flying a reconnaissance plane deep behind enemy lines. They were supposed to be protected by an electronic cloak of invisibility she had designed. But something went wrong. An unexpected solar flare, a miscalculation in the atmospheric conditions. She was never sure what it was. For a few critical seconds, the cloak flickered. It was just long enough. The enemy got a lock. She watched it happen on her screen. A tiny blip of light, that was her plane, and another, faster blip closing in. She heard the pilots' voices in her headset, calm at first, then rising in alarm. "Athena, we're painted. We're painted. We've lost the cloak." She had worked frantically, her fingers flying across the keyboard, trying to reboot the system, trying to throw up a wall of electronic noise, but it was too late. The last thing she heard was a burst of static, and then, a profound and terrible silence that the official report called it a tragic but acceptable loss in the pursuit of national security. But for Ellie, it was anything but acceptable. She had seen the faces of those pilots. She had promised them they would be safe. Her technology, her creation, had failed them. The weight of that failure was too much to bear. She had looked at the cold, glowing screens of her world and realized that the ones and zeros couldn't account for the human cost. So she vanished. She resigned her commission, signed a mountain of non-disclosure agreements that legally erased her past, and became Ellie Vance, a simple widow in a simple town. She had traded the world of ghosts for a world of substance, of warm coffee and friendly faces. A sharp noise from outside snapped her back to the present. It was the sound of a car engine, followed by the squeal of tires. She looked out her window, to see a pickup truck, one she didn't recognize, speeding away down the dark road. Her mailbox, which stood at the end of her driveway, was knocked over, lying on its side like a fallen soldier. It was a petty, childish act of vandalism, but the message was clear. They knew where she lived. The pilots or their friends on the base had escalated their game from impersonal flyovers to personal intimidation. They were no longer just buzzing her diner, they were coming to her home. She stood there for a long time looking at the toppled mailbox in the moonlight. The fear she felt was cold and real, but underneath it, something else was stirring. The old part of her, the part she had tried to bury in the desert sand, was beginning to wake up. Athena was stirring. She walked out of her house, not to the driveway, but to the old, dusty garage at the back of her property. It was Bill's old workshop. It was filled with his tools, his workbenches, the smell of oil and sawdust. For 10 years, she had barely set foot in it. She flicked on the single, bare light bulb that hung from the ceiling. The light cast long shadows over the clutter. She walked to the far corner to a large heavy wooden chest that had served as a coffee table in their first apartment. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. With a grunt of effort, she slid the heavy lid open. Inside, beneath a pile of old moth-eaten blankets, was her past. It wasn't a weapon, it was a collection of electronic components, circuit boards, and strange-looking antennas, all nestled in custom-cut foam. It was the prototype for a system she had designed years ago, a portable device she had nicknamed the Owl. It wasn't designed to be destructive, it was designed to be a key that could unlock almost any modern military communications or sensor system. It was a diagnostic tool, a way to test vulnerabilities. In the wrong hands, it was dangerous. In her hands, it was a solution. She reached in and lifted out a small, metallic box covered in dials and switches. It was cold to the touch. She hadn't held it in over 15 years. She looked at the complex array of controls, and for the first time in a decade, her mind felt truly clear. The fog of grief and quiet routine began to burn away, replaced by the sharp, focused clarity of a problem that needed to be solved. They had dismissed her, they had mocked her, they had threatened her. They had forgotten that the sky is not just a playground. It's a system of rules, protocols, and frequencies. And she had written half of those rules. They thought they were the ghosts in the machine. They were about to learn that she was the one who had built the machine in the first place. The days that followed took on a new secret rhythm. By day, Ellie was the same woman Mojave Springs had always known. She served breakfast with a smile, poured endless cups of coffee, and listened to the local gossip. But when the sun dipped below the mountains and the closed sign was flipped, in the diner's door, her real work began. The garage became her sanctuary, her command center. The Owl was a relic of a different era. Its components were bulky, its wiring complex. Modern systems were sleek, microscopic, almost organic. This was a beast of wires and solder, but the principles it operated on were as fundamental as gravity. The language of radio waves hadn't changed. Getting it to work was a battle. She was rusty, her fingers, accustomed to the gentle work of kneading dough, fumbled with a delicate soldering iron. Her eyes, used to reading order slips, strained to see the tiny markings on the old circuit boards. She had to dredge up knowledge that had been dormant for years, pulling complex equations and security protocols from the dusty corners of her mind. There were moments of deep frustration. A capacitor had leaked, corroding a vital connection. A power converter, designed for an old military-grade battery, was incompatible with anything she could buy at the local hardware store. She had to improvise, to cannibalize parts from an old shortwave radio Bill had kept, to MacGyver solutions with the limited tools at her disposal. Each small victory, like getting a single LED to light up on the control panel, felt like a monumental achievement. As she worked, the memories of her past life became sharper. She remembered late nights with her team, fueled by stale coffee and the thrill of discovery. She remembered the debates, the arguments, the shared passion for solving impossible puzzles. She had been a leader then, respected and admired. Now, she was alone in a dusty garage, a ghost trying to resurrect a ghost. Meanwhile, at the Air Force Base, the pilots of the F-22 squadron were growing more arrogant. Their unofficial campaign against the old lady in the diner had become a source of amusement. Major Viper Jensen saw it as a matter of principle. In his mind, civilians, especially those in forgotten little towns, needed to understand their place. They were beneficiaries of the freedom he and his men provided, and the cost of that freedom was the occasional inconvenience of a sonic boom or a rattled window. She needs to learn a lesson, Viper told his wingman, Green, as they planned their next flight. You don't poke the bear. We're the tip of the spear. We can't be worried about some civilians' broken neck. They started planning what they called the grand finale. It would be a final, undeniable demonstration of their power. A two-ship, high-speed, low-altitude pass, directly over the center of town, timed for midday when the diner would be busiest. It was a flagrant violation of every flight regulation in the book, a maneuver so dangerous that if anything went wrong, it could be catastrophic. But they were convinced of their own invincibility. They were flying the most advanced jets in the world. What could possibly go wrong? Back in Mojave Springs, people were starting to notice a change in Ellie. Sheriff Brody stopped by the diner one morning, his face etched with concern. "You doing okay, Ellie?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "You look tired. Folks are saying you're burning the midnight oil out in that old garage of yours." Ellie forced a smile. "Just some spring cleaning, John. A little late in the season is all." "Well," he said, lowering his voice, "if it's about those flyboys, you gotta be careful. I've been hearing whispers. They're not good kids, Ellie, they're arrogant. Poking them is not a good idea." "I'm not poking anyone, John," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm just a simple woman running a diner." But her friend wasn't convinced. He saw the new hardness in her eyes, the focused tension in her jaw. The soft, comforting Ellie he had known for years was still there, but now she was overlaid with a shadow of someone else, someone more formidable. He didn't understand it, but it worried him. Her isolation felt heavy, a burden she was carrying all by herself. One night, Ellie hit a wall. The main processing unit of the Owl refused to power on. She had checked every connection, tested every component, but it was dead. Despair washed over her. It was a fool's errand. She was an old woman in a garage trying to fight a billion-dollar military machine with scraps of junk from a bygone era. What was she thinking? She slumped onto a dusty stool, her head in her hands. The silence of the garage felt immense, mocking. She thought about giving up, about boarding up the broken window, and just enduring the harassment until the pilots got bored or were transferred. Then her eyes fell on Bill's old toolbox. It was a big, red, metal case, covered in grease stains and scratches. He had taken it with him on deployments all over the world. She opened it. Inside, nestled in a worn leather pouch, was a set of his specialized diagnostic tools. Instruments for testing the complex electronics of the jets he used to work on. She picked up one of the tools, a custom-made multimeter with a probe. She remembered Bill trying to explain to her what it did, something about isolating phantom power drains in complex circuits. At the time, she had just smiled and nodded her mind on other things, but now, looking at the tool, something clicked. Her world and Bill's world, which had always seemed so separate, her theoretical designs and his hands and mechanics were suddenly connected. She realized the problem with the Owl wasn't a broken part. It was a subtle energy leak, a phantom drain, just like the ones Bill used to hunt down. Using his tool, she meticulously traced the circuits, and there it was. A tiny, almost invisible hairline fracture in a power relay, bleeding energy before it could reach the processor. It was a problem her own sophisticated knowledge had overlooked, but one that a mechanic's practical tool could find. With trembling hands, she bypassed the faulty relay. She held her breath and flipped the power switch. The machine hummed to life. A series of green and amber lights flickered on across the control panel, bathing her face in their soft, determined glow. The ghost was awake. In the quiet of the garage, surrounded by the echoes of her past and the memory of her husband, Ellie felt a surge of hope. The pilots had their grand finale planned, but now so did she. With the owl now operational, Ellie's focus shifted from repair to refinement. The device was alive, but it was a wild, untamed thing. She had to calibrate it, to tune its frequency, emitters to the precise signatures of the F-22s' advanced avionics. This was the most dangerous part of her plan. It required her to listen, to capture the electronic fingerprint of the jets as they flew overhead. She spent her days in the diner, a small discreet antenna hidden in a flower pot outside the window, connected to a recording device under the counter. Each time the Raptors screamed past, she would capture a burst of data, their communication frequencies, the pulse rate of their radar, the unique electronic identifiers of their navigation systems. To anyone else, it was just static. To her, it was a symphony of information. At night, in the garage, she would feed this data into the owl, teaching it, training it. She wasn't building a weapon of destruction, she was forging a key that would fit the most sophisticated lock ever built. Her goal was not to cause harm, but to send a message, a clear, undeniable message, in a language the pilots would understand. One evening she was ready for a small-scale test. She couldn't risk targeting anything on the base, so she chose a different target, her own satellite television dish. It operated on a similar frequency band to some of the jet's non-critical systems. She aimed a small directional antenna at the dish on her roof, took a deep breath, and flipped a single switch on the owl's control panel. She sent out a single, coded pulse, no more powerful than a garage door opener. Inside her house, the television screen, which had been showing the evening news, flickered and went black. In its place, a simple, blocky image appeared, the stylized outline of an owl. It was crude, a low-resolution ghost she had programmed into the system years ago as a kind of digital signature. It stayed on the screen for exactly 5 seconds, then vanished, leaving the news broadcast to resume as if nothing had happened. Worked. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her knees buckle. The owl was more than a relic, it was still a masterpiece. But the test had also shown her a critical weakness. The power drain was immense. The old military battery she had painstakingly recharged could only hold enough energy for one full power, wide-spectrum broadcast. She would have one shot. If she missed, or if she timed it wrong, it was all over. Meanwhile, the ripples of the pilot's reckless behavior were beginning to spread. At the base, a few of the older, more experienced maintenance chiefs were getting nervous. They saw the flight data from Viper's squadron, the aggressive GI forces, the dangerously low altitudes. They saw the excessive fuel consumption and the unnecessary stress on the airframes. They muttered to each other in the hangars, but they were hesitant to file a formal report against a group of hotshot pilots who were clearly being protected by their squadron commander. The vague reports of aggressive training maneuvers and civilian complaints eventually made their way up the chain of command. Landing in a folder on the desk of General Marcus Thorne, the commander of the entire Air Combat Command. Thorne was a man who had seen it all, from dogfights in the Cold War to the dawn of the drone era. He was a serious, thoughtful leader who understood that arrogance was a greater threat to a pilot than any enemy missile. He read the report on the incidents around Mojave Springs. It was thin on details, but it set off a quiet alarm in his mind. He made a note to have a talk with the base commander. It was a small fire, but small fires, if left unattended, could burn down the whole forest. He didn't have enough to act on yet, but he was watching. The gathering storm now had a second, unseen front. The final piece of the puzzle fell into Ellie's lap by pure chance. A group of young airmen, fresh out of tech school, came into the diner for dinner. They were excited, full of nervous energy, and spoke a little too loudly. One of them, trying to impress his friends, mentioned the big show the F-22 pilots were putting on the next day. "Yeah, Major Jensen and his guys are doing a full-power flyby tomorrow," the young man boasted. "Right over this town. They're calling it Operation Shake and Bake. It's supposed to happen around noon. They're even going to film it from the cockpit." Ellie, who was refilling their water glasses, froze for a fraction of a second, her hand steady despite the sudden pounding of her heart. She didn't react, didn't let her face betray the explosion of adrenaline that went off inside her. She just smiled her simple, grandmotherly smile and moved on to the next table. But now she had the date, the time, the final confirmation she needed. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in the garage with the owl running final diagnostics. The machine emitted a low, steady hum, its lights blinking in the darkness like a vigilant creature. Waiting for the dawn, she felt a strange sense of peace. The fear and anger that had driven her for weeks had been burned away. leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer just defending her home and her town. She was defending a principle. She was defending the honor of the uniform that her husband had worn with such pride, the uniform that these arrogant young men were now disgracing. They thought they were untouchable, gods in their silver chariots. They were about to receive a message from an old ghost, a message from the earth, reminding them that no matter how high they flew, they were still connected to the world below. The clock was ticking. The storm was about to break. The morning of the flyover dawned with a deceptive calm. The sky over Mojave Springs was a vast, empty canvas of brilliant blue, but the town itself was quiet, holding its breath. The word had spread, whispered from neighbor to neighbor, from the diner to the gas station. Something was going to happen at noon. Most people decided to stay indoors, pulling their pets inside and securing anything that might blow away. It was a town bracing for a hurricane that only they knew was coming. Ellie rose before the sun. She went about her morning routine at the diner with a deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. She brewed the coffee, baked a fresh batch of cinnamon rolls, and wiped down the counters until they shone. A few of the regulars came in, their faces etched with worry. "You be careful today, Ellie," Old Man Hemlock said, his voice low. "Don't you go outside when they come." "I'll be fine, Henry," she said, patting his hand. "Don't you worry about me." At 11 o'clock, she flipped the close sign in the window, something she never did in the middle of the day. She locked the door and walked not to her house, but to the alleyway that ran behind the diner. There, parked in the shadows, was her old beat-up pickup truck. The back of the truck was her command center. The owl sat on a blanket, its metal case looking strangely out of place amidst the rust and dents of the truck bed. A thick cable ran from the device to the heavy-duty battery sitting beside it. From the main unit, a flat, panel-like antenna was mounted on a swivel, aimed at the empty sky. The setup was crude, a far cry from the climate-controlled bunkers of her past, but it was all she needed. She climbed into the truck bed and sat down beside her creation. She was hidden from the street, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. For her, she checked the connections one last time, her hands steady. She was no longer afraid. She was a professional, about to do a job, that as the town clock began to chime for noon, a new sound entered the air. It started as a low hum, a vibration, felt more than heard. Then it grew quickly into the familiar, soul-shaking roar of jet engines at full military power. From the east, two specks of silver appeared, growing larger with terrifying speed. They were flying in a tight, aggressive formation, and they were impossibly low. They weren't just breaking regulations, they were shattering them. This was not a flyby, this was an attack run. Inside the lead cockpit, Major Viper Jensen was in his element. His helmet display showed him a perfect high-definition view of the world rushing towards him. The little town of Mojave Springs grew in his sights. Could see the individual buildings, the cars on the street, the glint of the sun on the diner's window. "Ready to rock and roll, Green," he said into his cums, a grin spreading across his face. "Born ready, Viper," his wingman's voice crackled back. "Let's give them a show they'll never forget." Viper's thumb hovered over the button that would activate the cockpit camera. He wanted to capture the moment, to record the dust and chaos they were about to unleash on the little town that had dared to complain. He lined up his approach, the crosshairs on his display perfectly centered on the roof of the Desert Rose Diner. "Target in sight," he murmured, the words a force of habit from 1,000 training missions. "Engaging now." He pushed the throttle forward for the final burst of speed. The roar became a physical force, a wall of sound that slammed into the town. The windows of the diner bowed inward, the new crack in the glass spreading like a living thing in the alleyway. Ellie watched them come. She didn't flinch. Her eyes were fixed on the two silver jets as they grew from specks into monstrous, winged predators. She could feel the vibrations in her bones, in her teeth. The world seemed to be shaking apart. She waited, 1 second, 2 seconds. She'll let them get closer, let them commit completely to their reckless path. She had to time it perfectly. Too soon, and they could recover. Too late, and the damage would be done. Her hand rested on the main activation switch of the owl. It was a simple, red, covered switch, the kind that prevented accidental activation. She lifted the cover. The lead jet was now directly over the edge of town. It was the moment of maximum effect. "Now," she whispered to herself, and with a firm, steady motion, she flipped the switch. For the briefest fraction of a second, nothing happened. The F-22s continued their thunderous descent, a seemingly unstoppable force. But then, the invisible wave of energy from the owl, a silent, precisely tuned pulse, hit them. Inside Viper's cockpit, his world dissolved into chaos. It wasn't an explosion or a jolt of turbulence. It was something far more insidious. His head-up display, the transparent screen that projected all his critical flight information, flickered violently. The altitude readings, the airspeed indicator, the targeting crosshairs, it all vanished. In its place, a single, stark image bloomed into view, glowing with an eerie green light. A stylized owl, its eyes wide and unblinking. A cascade of alarms, a symphony of electronic screams, erupted in his ears. Master caution, flight controls, malfunction, radar, failure, engine fire. The warnings were impossible. A dozen critical systems all reporting catastrophic failure at the exact same moment. His hands, so sure and steady a moment ago, flew across his controls by pure instinct. He yanked back on the stick, pulling the jet out of its dive with a G-force that slammed him back into his seat. His wingman, Green, experiencing the same electronic nightmare, followed suit. "Viper, what's happening?" Green's voice yelled over the comms, laced with panic. "I've got nothing. My whole board is lit up. I think I'm on fire." But Viper couldn't answer. His own communication system was filled with a strange, high-pitched tone, a clean, pure sound that cut through the cacophony of the alarms. It was a sound that seemed to drill directly into his brain, disorienting him completely. He was flying blind, deaf, and dumb. The most advanced fighting machine in the world had been reduced to a metal shell, and he was just along for the ride. The ground, the effect was just as sudden and surreal. The deafening roar of the jets, which had been building to a painful crescendo, was abruptly cut off. The townspeople, cowering in their homes, looked up to see the two jets, which had been plummeting towards them, suddenly and violently pulled up. They climbed almost vertically, their engines screaming with the strain, and fled back towards the base as if chased by demons. And then, an eerie silence fell over Mojave Springs. It was a quiet so profound that it felt louder than the noise it had replaced. People slowly emerged from their homes and businesses, looking up at the empty sky, their faces a mixture of confusion and profound relief. They didn't know what had happened, but they knew it was over. In the alleyway, Ellie flipped the red switch back to the off position. The low hum from the owl died. The battery indicator was blinking red, completely drained. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede, leaving a deep-seated exhaustion in its place. She leaned back against the cold metal of her truck, her work done. Back at the Air Force Base, chaos reigned. The two F-22s landed hard, screeching to a halt on the runway. Emergency crews surrounded them, expecting to see smoke and flames, but there was nothing. The jets were physically pristine. Viper and Green were pulled from their cockpits, pale and shaken. They tried to explain what had happened, but their stories sounded like madness. Phantom alarms, a ghost image on the HUD, a paralyzing sound. In their headsets, the maintenance crews swarmed the jets, plugging them into diagnostic computers. The results that came back were baffling. The flight data recorders, the black boxes, were a mess. They showed a massive simultaneous electronic failure across dozens of systems. But when the crews tested those same systems on the ground, they all worked perfectly. There was no sign of malfunction, no blown circuits, no corrupted code. It was as if the event had never happened. And yet, the data recorder held the proof. And on every screen that replayed the HUD data, for a period of 5 terrifying seconds, was the clear, unmistakable image of an owl. The base commander immediately grounded the entire squadron. This was no longer a matter of discipline, it was a matter of national security. A multi-billion-dollar weapons system had been compromised, not by a missile or another aircraft, but by something else, something unknown. The word "ghosted" was whispered in the secure briefing rooms. Within hours, the report was on General Marcus Thorne's desk. When he read the description of the event and saw the still image of the AOL pulled from the flight recorder, he went cold. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window of his office, looking out at the sky. The memories came flooding back, not of failure, but of genius. Of a brilliant, stubborn woman who had a habit of signing her work in a very particular way. He turned to his aide. "Get me the personnel file for a Dr. Eleanor Vance," he said, his voice quiet and grim. "It will be in the deep archives." Classification. The project name was Chimera. Then he paused and added, "And get my car ready. I'm taking a drive." The drive to Mojave Springs was a quiet one. General Thorne drove himself, not in a staff car with flags and an entourage, but in a plain, unmarked sedan. He needed time to think. The owl symbol was a ghost from his past, a signature he hadn't seen in over 15 years. It was the calling card of a legend, a woman who had been one of the most brilliant minds he had ever worked with, and one of the most principled. He had been a young colonel back then, the military liaison for Project Chimera. He had witnessed firsthand the genius of Dr. Eleanor Athena Vance. He had also been there when she walked away, her face a mask of grief and disillusionment after the loss of the reconnaissance plane. He had tried to talk her out of it, but her mind was made up. She had vanished, and the Air Force, respecting her wish for anonymity and bound by the secrecy of her work, had let her go. He had often wondered what became of her. Now, it seemed, he knew. He pulled up in front of the Desert Rose Diner. It looked exactly as the file described, simple, clean, and unassuming. He could see a new, jagged crack in the large front window. He got out of the car and walked inside. The diner was quiet. A few regulars sat in the booths, speaking in low tones. Behind the counter, wiping it down with a cloth, was a woman with kind eyes and graying red hair tied back in a bun. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment, their eyes met. He saw a flicker of recognition, of the sharp intelligence he remembered, before it was veiled by the placid expression of a small-town diner owner. He took a seat at the counter. "I'll have a coffee, please," he said, his voice even. She poured a cup and set it in front of him. "On the house," she said softly. They sat in silence for a long moment, the unspoken history hanging in the air between them. Finally, the general spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "The owl was a nice touch, Athena." Ellie didn't look up from the counter she was wiping. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "My name is Ellie. I have two of the best pilots in the world in my infirmary," Ellie Thorne continued, his tone gentle but firm. "They think they saw a ghost. They're scared, not of an enemy, but of the unknown. They flew their F-22s into a hornet's nest, and the hornet's nest won. You want to tell me why?" Ellie finally stopped wiping the counter and looked at him, her eyes full of a weary sadness. "Because they wouldn't listen," she said simply. "Because they were acting like bullies, not soldiers. They were terrorizing my town, my friends. They were disrespecting the uniform Bill wore, the uniform you wear. I called your office. I was dismissed. I did it your way, Marcus, and your way failed." The general nodded slowly, a deep sense of shame washing over him. She was right. The system he commanded, the chain of command he believed in, had failed her. "So you reminded them," he said. "You reminded them that the sky has rules." "I reminded them that they aren't gods," she corrected him. "I just ... rang their doorbell a little loudly." The next day, two black government cars pulled up to the diner. This time, General Thorne was in his full-dressed uniform. With him were Major Cody, Viper Jensen, and his wingman, Green. The two pilots were pale and subdued, their usual arrogance completely gone, replaced by a nervous, confused apprehension. The general led them into the empty diner where Ellie was. Waiting, he had them stand before the counter like two schoolboys in the principal's office. "Major Jensen, this is Mrs. Eleanor Vance," the general said, his voice ringing with authority. "She is the woman whose property you damaged, and whose life you made a misery. You know her as the owner of this diner. I know her as Dr. Vance, one of the chief architects of the very avionics and electronic warfare systems you fly with every day. The ghost you encountered was not a malfunction. It was a lesson. A lesson from the woman who wrote the book you haven't even read yet. You will apologize to her now." Viper stared at Ellie, his mind struggling to connect the image of the simple, quiet woman before him with the terrifying, omnipotent force that had humbled him in the sky. He saw the strength in her eyes, the unyielding integrity, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly small. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cracking. I am sorry. We were ... arrogant. We were wrong. There's no excuse." Ellie just looked at him, her expression softening. "I accept your apology, Major," she said. "Just remember, the power you've been given isn't a toy, it's a trust. Don't break it." The pilots were not discharged. Their careers were saved, but their records now carried a sealed addendum, a permanent reminder of their encounter with Athena. Their arrogance, however, was shattered for good. Life in Mojave Springs returned to normal, but with a subtle difference. The sound of jets was still heard, but it was different now. It was higher, more distant, more respectful. The pilots gave the little town a wide, courteous berth. A few weeks later, a package arrived for Ellie. Inside was a new, beautifully crafted wooden frame, and a check from the Air Force that was more than enough to replace her window. Bill's picture in the new frame and set it back on the shelf. She stood behind her counter, looking out at the quiet highway. The dust of the Mojave was settling again, but this time, it felt like a blanket of peace. The simple woman of Mojave Springs had been challenged by the most powerful machines in the sky, and she had won, not with weapons, but with wisdom. She had stopped them cold, not by breaking them, but by reminding them of who they were supposed to be. And in the quiet of her diner, surrounded by the simple life she had chosen, the legend of Athena finally found her peace.